If you're enjoying this deep dive into one of the most critical moments of the American Revolution, please hit that like button and subscribe to the channel. It helps us bring you more incredible, untold stories from history. This campaign will end the war. That was the opinion given by Richelieu, and through Lord Suffolk he edicted the continued favor of the British king, who was in his eyes the arbiter of all the universe. Flushed with expectations of glory, Carleton employed the unusually mild winter in preparations. On the last day of April, he gave audience to the deputies of the Six Nations and accepted their services with thanks and gifts. Other hordeties of Indians were engaged under leaders of their own approval. "We need colonists," said Richelieu. "If these will not, we are ruined in war." To secure the Mohawks to the British side, Joseph Brant urged them to abandon their old abode for lands more remote from the Americans. To counteract his authority, Gass, near the end of May, still spoke to a council of warriors of the Six Nations. "The United States are now one people. Suffer not any evil spirit to lead you into war. Brothers of the Mohawks, you will be no more a people from the time your ancient buildings are proud up, and we had to call on you in veiling upon you to leave the sweet stream so beloved by your forefathers. Lie at your birthless cancer. Before many moons pass away, the pride of England will be laid low. Then how happy will it make you to reflect that you have preserved the neutrality so earnestly recommended to you from the beginning of the war. You know your great fame and power as warriors. The only reason why they did not ask your help against the cruelty of the king was that they thought it unnecessary to offend you. You see a quarrel in which you had no concern. Brothers, treasure all I have now said in your hearts, for the day will come when you will hold my memory in veneration for the good advice contained in this speech." The settlers in the land which this year took the name of Vermont refused by a great majority to come under the jurisdiction of New York. On the 15th of January, 1777, their convention declared the independence of their state. At Windsor, on the 2nd of June, they appointed a committee to prepare a constitution, and they hoped to be received into the American Union. But at New York, Congress, by an uncertain majority against a determined minority, disclaimed all connection with the new state. Gates charged St. Clair to call lustily for aid of all kinds, for no general overled by surplus numbers or over-preparation, and he then repaired to Philadelphia to intrigue for the detachment. On the 12th, St. Clair, the best of the brigadiers then in the north, reached Ticonderoga. 5 days later, Schuyler visited his army. Mount Defiance, which overlooks the outlet of Lake George and was the key of the position, had not been occupied. From the old French entrenchments to the southeastern station on the Vermont side, the breath-planned and unfinished defenses extended more than 2.5 miles, and from end to end of the straggling lines and inhabited blockhouses, swarms of workmen were toiling at the neglected force. The British could reach the place by land any day, 50 days before the continent troops the post occupied. From the south, the gate of communication by the Grand Portage between Ticonderoga and Mount Independence was absolutely open. A necessity for evacuating the post might arise, but Schuyler almost forbore giving definite instructions, not returning to Albany, busied himself with forwarding to Ticonderoga supplies for a long siege.
On the 6th of May, Burgoyne arrived at Quebec. Carleton received with unqualified approbation his own part in the last campaign, and ordering him, for the speedy quelling of the unnatural rebellion, to resume the inferior office of command of the Canadian Army as soon as it should cross the boundary of the province of Quebec. Answering with passionate perturbation the just reproaches of Germain and of his colleague Lord Amherst, he at once yielded up the chief command without questioning obedience to the requisitions of Burgoyne. Contracts were made for 1,500 horses and 600 carts. 1,000 Canadians, reluctant and prone to desertion, were called out as teamsters and pioneers, and as many weeks' supplies for the army were crowded forward upon the one line of communication by the Sorrel. Burgoyne had very nearly all the force which he had represented as sufficient. His officers were well chosen, especially Phillips and Hamilton as major generals, and the Highlander Fraser as an acting brigadier. A diversion from which great consequences were expected was to proceed by way of Lake Ontario to the Mohawk Valley. Sir William Howe in the south and Burgoyne had orders to force a junction with his army. On the 15th of June, Burgoyne advanced from St. John's, as he thought, to easy victories and high promotion. His detachments intended their husbands, promising themselves to kill, scalp, and destroy the Americans and Indians, shedding the first blood, brought in 10 scalps and as many British prisoners. The next day, at the upper part of the lake, a little north of Crown Point, Burgoyne, the applauded writer of plays for the stage, gathering round him the chief officers of his army in their gala uniforms, met in Congress about 400 Iroquois and the chiefs of many other savage tribes. Algonquin, with many of his young warriors too, appealed to what he called their wild honor. "Warriors, you are free. Go forth in might of your valor and your cause. Strike at the common enemies of Great Britain and America, disturbers of public order, peace, and happiness, destroyers of commerce, parricides of the state. The circle round you was the field of His Majesty's bounty and of His royal beneficence. The lot of those of the princes, His allies, esteem you as brothers in the war, equally great in glory and in friendship. We will reciprocally give and receive examples. Do it our task to regulate your passions when they are into the field of battle, perfectly tempered when you are not opposed in arms. Aged men, women, children, and prisoners must be held sacred from the knife or hatchet, even in the time of actual conflict. You shall receive compensation for the prisoners you take, but you shall be called to account for scalps. Your customs have allowed an idea of honor you have acquired, but the scalps of victory, which should be prized more in your opinion, are the pretenses as they're to be taken from the wounded or even dying. Should the enemy, on their part, dare to countenance acts of barbarity towards those who may fall into their power, it shall be yours also to retaliate." An old Iroquois chief replied, "When you speak, we hear the voice of our great father beyond the great lake. We have been tried and tempted by the Bostonians, but we loved our fathers, and hatchets have been sharpened on our affections. In proof of sincerity, our whole villages, able to go to war, are come forth. The old and infirm, our infants, and our wives alone remain at home. With one common assault, we promise a constant obedience to all you here further order, and may the Father of Days give you many, many successes." Burgoyne himself, the Indians according to their custom, Burgoyne published his speech, which reflected his instructions. Edmund Burke, who had learned that the natural ferocity of those tribes far exceeded the ferocity of all barbarian mentioned in history, pronounced that they were not fit allies for the king in a war with his people, that Englishmen should never confirm their evil habits by flushing them in the slaughter of British colonists. In the House of Commons, Fox censured the king for suffering Indians' sanguinary will. It was well known that brutality, murder, and destruction were ever inseparable from Indian association in war. When Pownall undertook to defend the minister, he avowed that it was by the means which God and nature had put into their hands. Chatham laid down the most decisive indignation at these abominable principles, and this more abominable approval of them.
In a proclamation issued at Crown Point, Burgoyne, claiming to speak in Christianity and in the solidarity of the bond of soldierdom, enforced his persuasions to the Americans by menaces of these: "Let them consider their own distance from my camp. I have but to give stretch to the Indian forces under my direction, and they amount to thousands, to overtake the hardened enemies of Great Britain. If the frenzy of hostility should remain, I trust I shall stand acquitted in the eyes of God and man in executing the vengeance of the state against the willful outcasts." Burgoyne's proclamation, which declared that the army under St. Clair must not retreat, while St. Clair wrote to Schuyler, "Behold, the enemy comes on as fast as they came." On the 1st of July, the invading army moved on to Lake Champlain. As they commenced on the fort, Ticonderoga and Mount Independence, the rank and file, exclusive of Indians, numbered 3,922 British, 3,016 Germans, 250 provincials, besides 475 belonging to Riedessel's reserve and the train of artillery. On the 3rd, one of St. Clair's aides promised Washington to be out of danger. On the 4th, Burgoyne, Redsel, was studying how to invest Mount Independence. On the 4th, up the waters and slopes of the Mount Lake George and hemmed in Ticonderoga on that side. In the following days, a detachment of infantry, following the instructions of Lieutenant Twiss of the Engineers, took possession of Mount Defiance on a very near battery from the chain of redoubts on the Vermont side, commanding the water department of Mount Independence. "We must away," said St. Clair. His general of the 1st Division of the Army said the retreat must be made the very next night. The garrison, according to the best officers present, under 5,000 men, of whom 2/3 were effective, but with scarcely more than 1,000 rank and file fit for duty. One woman and the brands and such stores as there was time to take were sent in boats up the lake to Whitehall, while the great body of the army, comprising the troops, took the new road through the wilderness to Hubbardton. At Ticonderoga there remained 4 vast meat stores, 4 hundreds of oxen, more than 70 cannon, and a large number of tents. Burgoyne, who came up in the fleet, sent Fraser with 20 companies of English grenadiers, followed by Redsel's infantry and reserve corps, in pursuit of the army of St. Clair. And as soon as the channel between Ticonderoga and Mount Independence could be cleared, the fleet bearing Burgoyne and the rest of his forces moved after the detachment which had escaped by water. The Americans, burning 3 of their vessels, abandoned 2 others and the fort at Whitehall. Everything which they brought from Ticonderoga was destroyed or fell in prey to their pursuers. On the same day, Burgoyne reported to his government that the army of Ticonderoga was dilapidated and feeble. The evacuation was a signal triumph. He predicted a rapid progress and predicted an early junction of the 2 armies. Many, indignant in England, whether most to admire the sword or the pen of Burgoyne, and were sure of the entire nation in the Confederate provinces before Christmas. Public opinion rose against Schuyler. Of the evacuation of Ticonderoga, Hamilton reasoned rightly. If the post was untenable or required a larger number of troops to defend it than can be spared for the purpose, it ought to have never been foreseen and given up. Instead of that, we have kept a large quantity of cannon in it and have been heaping up very valuable magazines of stores and provisions that in the critical moments all of our resources are abandoned and lost. So prized the public and Congress. Schuyler had, at the close of his expectations to the command, taken upon himself the reproach for having piled up ample stores within its walls. He sought to escape from condemnation by insisting that the retreat was made without the least hint from himself and was ill-judged and not warranted by necessity. With manly frankness, St. Clair assumed as his own the praiseworthy act which had saved to the country many of its best general defenders.
On the 2nd of July, the Convention of Vermont assembled at Windsor. The organic law which they enacted, binding the culture of their age with the traditions of Protestantism, assumed that all men are born free and with inalienable rights, that they may emigrate from one state to another or form a new state in vacant countries. They provided for the Lord's Day and keep up some sort of religious worship, that every man may choose for himself the minister to which shall seem to him most agreeable to the revealed will of God. They provided for a school in each town, a grammar school in each county, and a university in the state. All officers to be elected and legislative were to be chosen annually and by ballot. The freemen of every town and all owners, the inhabitants, were electors. Every member of the House Representatives must declare his belief in one God, the revealer of the good and the punisher of the wicked, in his revelation to mankind of a rule of life and conduct. This is his religion. The legislative power was vested in one General Assembly, subject to no veto, though an advisory power was given to a board consisting of the governor, lieutenant governor, and 6 and 12 councillors. There were freedom from taxes forever, and there could be no imprisonment for debt. Once in 7 years, an elective council of censors was to take care freedom and the Constitution were preserved in purity. The pointed similarity of this system of that of Pennsylvania is ascribed to the Vermont Scouts, who had just published an address to the people of Philadelphia, who the legal authority of the convention was postponed lest the process of change should interfere with the public defense, for which the Vermont Council of Safety appropriated aid from the New Hampshire Committee at Exeter and from Massachusetts. On the night of the 6th, Fraser and his party made their bivouac 17 miles from the lake with that of Stockwell. 3 miles in their rear, at 3 in the morning of the 7th, both detachments were in motion. The largest body of the American rear guard under Warner, contrary to his instructions, had encamped for the night at Hubbardton. His allies, short of Castleton, Fraser at 5 ordered his troops to advance. To their great surprise, Warner, who was nobly assisted by Colonel Eben Francis and his New Hampshire regiment, turned and began the attack. The English were the first assailed. When Francis, with a vanguard and company of riggers, came up, their grand playing, the men singing a battle hymn. Francis fell at their head, charged at the head of his regiment, and held his enemies at bay till he fell. On the approach of the 3 German battalions, his men retreated toward the south. Fraser, taking Rethel to the hunt, flanked him for the timely rescue. Of the Americans, few were killed, and most of those engaged in the fight made good their retreat. In the firing of the day, the British took more than 200 stragglers, wounded men, and invalids. Of the Brunswick Corps, not all dead or wounded. Of the British, 155. The country lost 17 commissioned officers. At St. Clair, with 1,000 Continental troops, marched unmolested to Fort Edward. The British pursued, which reached Fort Edward from Whitehall, took ground within a mile of Fort Anne. On the morning of the 18th, of garrisons from St. Clair, Ticonderoga, a captain and 3 privates, and inflicted a loss of at least 50 in killed and wounded. Reinforced by a brigade, the English returned only to find the fort burned down and the garrison beyond reach. Burgoyne chose to celebrate these events by a day of thanksgiving. Another disappointment awaited him. He asked Carleton to hold Ticonderoga with a part of the 3,000 troops left in Canada. Carleton, pleading his instructions, which confined him to his own province, refused and left Burgoyne to obtain the soldiers from contracts. For the privates contracted for, not more than 1/3 arrived in good condition. Over 2/3 of commissioned officers of rank were wanting in green wood and were deficient in number. Further, Burgoyne should have munitions from New York all the way up the Hudson River by way of Lake George and the Old Road, but the wood was choked with rocks. A fortnight took the shortcut to Fort Edward through a wilderness bristling with stumps, numerous creeks, and treacherous with morasses. He reports with complacency the construction more than 50 bridges, a zigzag work over a morass 2 miles in extent, and the removal of layers of fallen timber left by the persistent toil of his sappers and of midsummer among myriads of insects, dispirited his troops.
Early in July, Burgoyne confessed to Germain that were the Indians left to themselves, enormities too horrid to think of would ensue. Guilty and innocent, women and infants would be a common prey. The general, nevertheless, resolved to use them as instruments of terror and promised, after arriving at Albany, to send them to Canada in consequence and box.
and knowing full well that they were left to themselves by La Corne Saint-Luc, their leader, who was impatient of control in the use of the scalping knife. Every day the savages brought in equally as well as prisoners. On the 22nd, Jane McCrae, a young woman of 20, betrothed to a loyalist in the British service and extending herself under the protection of British arms, was riding from Fort Edward to the British camp at Sandy Hill, escorted by 2 Indians. The Indians, at a half-mile from Fort Edward, one of them sank his tomahawk in her skull. The incident was not of unusual barbarity, but this massacre of a betrothed girl on her way to her lover touched all who heard the story. Burgoyne, from fear of the total defection of the Indians, pardoned the assassin. Schuyler owed his place to his social position, not military talents. Anxious and suspected of a want of personal courage, he found everything go ill under his command. To the constant metal exposure of St. Clair, raw and suffering from the base, he was unable to restore confidence. He called the militia when the people, the citizen soldier of New York, turned a deaf ear to the appeal. Washington, to the Council of Safety, will make him peculiarly useful as the head of your state. Schuyler's private family and connections do not entitle him to so distinguished a preeminence. There could be no hope of the good campaign but with the hearty cooperation of New England. Of Schuyler, he wrote, "New England, and British Commander-in-Chief, has left his testimony that when brought to action, they were the most persevering of all." New England himself, Schuyler gave leave for 1/2 of them to go home at views, which he is to follow in 3 weeks, and then called upon Washington to supply their places by troops from the south of Hudson River, saying to his friends that 1 Southern soldier was worth 2 from New England. On the 22nd, long before Burgoyne was ready to advance, Schuyler retreated to a position 4 miles below Fort Edward. Here again he complained of his exposure to immediate danger. His friends urged him to choose the growing suspicion of his want of spirit. He answered, "If there's a battle, I shall certainly expose myself more than is prudent." To the New York Council of Safety, he wrote on the 24th, "I mean to dispute every inch of ground with Burgoyne and resist his descent as long as possible." And in less than a week, without deposing anything, he retreated to Saratoga, leaving his heart set on a position at the junction of the Mohawk and Hudson. The enemy, being superior in every respect, was baiting on him. On the 1st of August, Schuyler wrote to the Council of Safety of New York, "I have been on horseback in a state scouting the country for a place to encamp that will give me a chance of stopping the enemy's career. I have not yet been able to find a spot that has the least prospect of answering this purpose, and I fear we will soon be obliged to retire still farther south. I wish that I could say that the troops under my command were in good spirits. They are quite otherwise. Under these circumstances, the enemy are acquiring strength and advancing." On the 4th of August, he sent word to Congress that Burgoyne is at Fort Edward. He has withdrawn his troops from Carleton and is bending his whole force this way. He probably is here in about 4 days and as well supplied as ever. On the 6th, Schuyler writes to Governor Clinton of New York, "The enemy will soon move and our strength is daily decreasing. We shall again be obliged to decamp and retreat before them," and has ebbed his resources from Washington. The hot Ticonderoga alarmed the patriots of New York, gladdened the Royalists, and fixed the wavering Indians as enemies. 5 counties along of the army of 3 others suffered from starvation and anarchy. Tryon counted from the shock his spirit to enforce the laws and wrote immediately to the Congress, and the militia of Westchester were called to their own defense. In the other country, the men enough remained at home to secure the bountiful harvest. Burgoyne, in his boast, threatened the plain and every part of the Hudson. New York became the battleground for the life of the young republic and ended Schuyler's prayers for reinforcements.
The commander-in-chief, in the plan of the campaign, had assigned to the Northern Department more than its share of troops and resources, and had added one brigade which was beyond the engagement and of which his blood in pressing need, for the army of Howe was twice or thrice as numerous as that of Washington. It was essential to strengthen Washington from the Hudson to Maryland required to be guarded. The earnestness from Schuyler, from the Council of New York, from Jay and Governor Morris as deputies of that council, almost worn upon Washington. Alarmed by Schuyler's want of fortitude, he referred to the North Arnold, who was fearless, rapid in Lincoln, who was acceptable to all the northern states, and even though it weakened his own army, transferred to him. He calculated one more brigade of Continental troops and one regiment of militia, on which occasion he wrote directly to the brigadier generals of Massachusetts and Connecticut, urging them to hasten the Bostonians and give 1/3 part of the militia under their command. At the same time, he bade Schuyler keep or oppose in front to keep much superior of 5,000 men. To think of the forces which might advance under Burgoyne could not fortified post left behind them, that their progress must be delayed by their baggage and artillery and be necessarily slow. Arnold should go to the east of Fort Edward Wicks, that if the invaders continued to set in detachments, one vigorous effort upon some one of these detachments might prove fatal to the whole expedition. In a like spirit, he counseled to the Council of New York the most sensible pleasure at the cautious of the state disagreement, as was which found every discouragement. He predicted Burgoyne's success, which advantages the success of Burgoyne he predicted would be temporary. The southern states could still be asked to excite their force, since it was all needed to keep Howe at bay. The attachment of the eastern states to the same general deliverance when invoked for the safety of a sister state of themselves, of the instrument. The worst effect of the fear is which the eastern states seceded by its eastern neighbors, Burgoyne would find it equally difficult to advance or to retreat. All this while, Schuyler continued to despond. On the 13th of August, he could not write from Stillwater to Washington a report of any material event, but there was a superior force daily increasing in numbers, and which will be doubtless will General Burgoyne beat us all. Albany and all approved Albany accepted applause for the wisdom of his safe retreat. The first serious blow was struck by the barbarians of Tryon County. Burgoyne, on his return to London in 1775, had censured Carleton to Germain for not having sent by Lake Ontario and the Oswego and Mohawk River an auxiliary expedition, which might have cut off the American retreat from Ticonderoga, and he urged the details for its execution, chiefly by savages. To Carleton, whom he instead of extolling former Indians' flattery, he announced the king's resolution that every means should be employed that Providence had put in His Majesty's hand for crushing the rebellion. This detachment, which was set apart for the force under the command of Colonel Barry St. Leger, varying from the schedule of Germain in its constitutional parts more than in its numbers, exceeded 750 white men. The Six Nations inclined to the Americans, standing in fear of being finally abandoned by the king, stood aloof. One, therefore, Joseph Brant, on his return from England, was to rally them and form them to leave their old hunting grounds. The Oneidas were friendly to the Americans. Arnold had been sent to Butler at Iroquoian, assured them that there was no hindrance in the warpath, that they would have only to look on and see Fort Stanwix fall. And for 7 days he lavished largesses on the fighting men and on their wives and children. His party joined the white men, and not far from more than 1,000 Indian warriors, certainly more than 800, joined the White Brigade of St. Leger. In addition to these, Hamilton, the lieutenant governor of Detroit, in obedience to orders from the Secretary of State, sent out 15 several parties, consisting in the aggregate of 289 braves, with 30 white officers and rangers, who proved on the frontiers of Pennsylvania and Virginia. Collecting his forces as he advanced from Montreal by way of Oswego, St. Leger on the 3rd of August came near the carrying place, where for untold ages the Indians had borne their canoes from the waters of Lake Ontario to those of the St. Lawrence, from those of the Hudson. Fort Stanwix was to be well constructed, held by Continentals against artillery, and garrisoned by 600 or 700 men under Lieutenant Colonel Ganservorst. A messenger from there to Sister brought word that General Nicholas Herkimer and the militia of Tryon County were marching to the relief.
A plan was made to lay for them an ambush of savages.
During the evening, the savages filled the woods with yells. The next morning, having laid aside their blankets and robes of fur and all, went out, naked or clad only in hunting shirts, prepared for the woods. The ambuscade was formed chiefly by Sir John Johnson and Royal Yorkers, by Colonel Butler and Rangers, by Claus and Canadians, and by Lieutenant Byrd and regulars. The freeholders of the Mohawk Valley, most of them with the sons of Germans from the Palatinate for officers, 700 or 800 in number, unintentioned and not in strength of the besieging party, marched carelessly through the wood. About an hour before noon, when they were within 6 miles of Fort Stanwix, a part of their vanguard was suddenly surprised in front by Johnson and his Yorkers, while the Indians attacked their flanks on every side, and the whites and muskets rushed in with their tomahawks. The patriots fell without entrenchments or falling ground and fought against superior numbers. There was no chance for tactics in the Battle of the Wilderness. Savage fierceness fought behind trees or fallen logs, or the white man born on the banks of the Mohawk wrestled single-handed with the Seneca warrior, like himself, the child of the soil. Herkimer was badly wounded near the knee, but he was borne to the ground, giving orders to the end. Thomas Spencer fell the death of a hero. The battle raged for at least an hour and a half. When the strength of the invaders increased, Vischer and his militia broke in wild valor. 33 or more among them, the chief warriors of the Senecas, lay dead, and nearly 70, about so many more, were badly wounded. Of the Yorkers, 1 captain of the loss was 2 were killed, 1 missing, and 38. What ensued is not told. The British loss, including savages and white men, was probably about 100. 3 men having crossed the Moines into Fort Stanwix to announce the approach of Herkimer, the besiegers discovered a detachment of Colonels Marinus Willett made a sally with 250 men, half of New York, half of Massachusetts, Lieutenant Colonel Adam Willett. The result would be for the quarters of the Yorkers, the Rangers, and the savages, driving before them whites and Indians, chiefly squaws and children, capturing Sir John Johnson's papers, 5 British flags, the baggage and new blankets and kettles of the Indians, and 4 prisoners. Learning from them the check to Herkimer, the party of Willett returned quickly to Fort Stanwix, bearing their spoils on their shoulders. The recaptured colors were displayed on the continental flag to the besieging party, and the deployed Indians were frantic at the loss of their stores and warriors. They suffered in the chill nights from the loss of their pelts, tents, and fire, and even the torturing and killing their captives beyond endurance, and indulged, could not relent their beginning to return home. Meantime, Willett, as a farewell act to the companion, both good woodsmen, made their way past the British guards at the Mohawk camp at the river in the night, unharmed. Schuyler charged Arnold with an expedition to relieve the garrison. Long before its approach, an Indian ran into St. Leger's camp, reporting that 1,000 men were coming against them. Another followed, doubling the number. A third brought a rumor that 3,000 were coming. Deaf to remonstrations and entreaties from their superiors and from St. Leger, the old warriors robbed the British officers of their clothes, plundered the boats, and made off with the booty. St. Leger, in a panic, though Arnold was not within 40 miles, hurried after them before nightfall, leaving his tents, artillery, and stores. It was Herkimer who first reversed the gloomy scene of the Northern Campaign. His memorable bravery in the Mohawk Valley served the love of country, not for reward. He did not want a continental command or money. Before many days, Congress had conferred upon him the highest gifts of his power, and they decreed him a monument. Gansevoorst was honored to hold a sword presented to him by the ministry, and in due time the British Parliament were informed that they could not the tremendously countered savages upon their friends, that they could not be controlled, that they killed 15 captives, that they grew more and more unreliable and impetuous.
when the Seneca warriors returning to their lodges told the story of the slaughter of their grand chiefs, their villages rang with yells of grief and hosts of mourners.
Burgoyne, who on the 30th of July made his headquarters on the banks of the Hudson, had detachments from 17 state stations. A brigadier officer described them as tall, warlike, and enterprising, but fiendishly wicked. On the 3rd of August, they brought in 20 scalps and many captives, and Burgoyne approved their incessant activity. But the American side of the country, it appeared in orders to each regiment that the savages were enjoined to upon every prisoner who should be brought in. The Ottawas longed to ravage away, and on the 5th of August, Burgoyne took from all his red warriors a pledge to stay through the campaign. On the 6th, he reported himself to General Howe as well forward, impediment to gain the mouth of the Mohawk, but not likely to be at Albany before the 22nd or the 23rd of the month. To aid St. Leger for a diversion and fill his army with drat cattle, horses, and provisions from fabled magazines at Bennington, Burgoyne, on the 11th of August, formed an expedition on the left, commanded by Baum, a Brunswick colonel of dragoons, and composed of 2 detachments than 400 Brunswickers. Baum, artillerists with 2 cannon, the light corps of British marksmen, a party of Fraser's Canadians, a more numerous party of provincial royalists, and a horde of about 150 Indians. Burgoyne, in the urgency of procuring supplies, let it be known that they would march directly upon Bennington. After disposing of the stores at that place, he might cross the Connecticut River, descended the Connecticut River to Brattleboro, and enter Albany with St. Leger and his savages. The latter part of the 13th, Baum encamped about 4 miles from Bennington on a hill that rises from the Wallamsack just within the state of New York. When early on the morning of the 14th a reconnoitering party of American was seen, he wrote in high spirit for more troops and introduced among his intendments. Burgoyne sent him orders to maintain his position at all events until reinforced. Brayman of Brunswick, lieutenant colonel, with 2 Brunswick battalions and 2 companies, marched in a soaking rain through thick woods to his support. The legislature of New Hampshire in the middle of July, receiving the supplicatory letter from Vermont, promptly resolved to cooperate with them in the sense of they ordered Stark with a brigade of militia to stop the progress of the enemy on their western frontier. Urging at the call, the men of New Hampshire flew to his standard, which he set up near Bennington, thousands of them, and not a few from southern Vermont. Schuyler ordered to follow their own rate plan. Schuyler brought upon Stark the censure of Congress, but the weight of the consenting with Seth Warner of Vermont made his bivouac on the 14th of August at the distance of a mile from the post of Baum, to whom he vainly offered battle. The regiment of Warner came down from Manchester between the 6th and the 15th, and troops arrived from the westernmost county of Massachusetts. When the sun rose on the 16th, Stark conferred with his plan for the day. Baum, settling small bodies of men in his detachments and carrying fowling pieces without bayonets, was nearly all his camp, scattering for fodder for horses, and a few hundred men under Nichols and Herrick swung around to the rear. While his attention was arrested by a feint, 200-strong parties, each of Stark and 200 or 300 took the front. At 3 o'clock, Baum was attacked on every side. The Indians scattered between the 2 wings of the loaded cannon, failing to pick off the gunners. Men, after about an hour to 2 hours, New England sharpshooters picking up wickers slackened from scarcity of powder, the Americans scaled the breastwork and fought them hand to hand. Baum ordered his infantry with the bayonet, his dragoons with their swords drew sabers face to face, but his attempt to cut his way, but in the strife wounded, and his veteran troops surrendered. Just at that moment, all who landed in the rear of the total defection of the Indians pardoned the assault. Schuyler owed his place to his social position, not to military talents. Anxious and suspected by friends of personal honor, he found everything go ill under his command.
To his constituents and some of St. Clair, he was suffering the 3 New England colonies of their clothes and tents. He was unable to restore confidence. He could not fill his ranks than the people. The choice fell now on the governor of Washington to the Council of Safety will make him peculiarly serviceable at the head of your state. Schuyler's proper campaign, but with the hearty cooperation of New England. Of the 5 New England men on British commander-in-chief, he has left his testimony that when brought to action, they were and not 1/3 of all Arnold's forces in America. Yet Schuyler gave leave for half of them to go home at once, were to follow in 4 weeks, and then ordered Washington to supply their places by troops from the south of Hudson River, saying to his friends that 1 Southern soldier was worth 2 from New England. On the 22nd, long before Burgoyne was ready to advance, Schuyler retreated to a position 4 miles below Fort Edward. Here again he complained of his exposure to immediate failure. His friends urged for the spirit to encourage the general suspicion of his want of spirit. He answered, "If there is a battle, I shall certainly expose myself more than prudent." To the New York Council of Safety he wrote on the 24th, "I mean to dispute every inch of ground with Burgoyne and retard his descent as long as possible." And in less than a week, without disputing a single inch, he retreated to Saratoga, having his boats set on a position at the junction of the Mohawk and Hudson. The American forces were retiring, being in confusion and under panic. And then, on August 1st, Schuyler, on the 1st of August, wrote to the Council of Safety of the state of New York, "I have not the meanest idea that these are all disposed, committing the country for a place to encamp on that will give us a chance of stopping the enemy's career. I have not yet been able to find a spot that has the least prospect of answering my purpose, and I fear they will follow them till all are retired still further south. I wish that I could say that the troops under my command are in good spirits. They are quite otherwise. Under these circumstances, the enemy are gaining strength and advantage."
On the 4th of August, he sent word to Congress that Burgoyne is now at Fort Edward. He has withdrawn his troops from Castleton and is bending his whole force this way. He will probably be here in 8 good days and may be well advanced in that time. On the 6th, Schuyler writes to Governor Clinton of New York, "I fear the enemy will soon move, will outgeneral us daily, decreasing. We shall again be obliged to decamp and retreat before them." And, as his only resource, he begged aid from Washington. The loss of Ticonderoga alarmed the patriots of New York, gladdened the Royalists, and fixed the wavering Indians as enemies. 5 counties and their inhabitants suffered from starvation and anarchy. Tryon counties implored immediate aid. The militia of Westchester were called to their own defense. In the other counties, gentlemen enough remained at home to reap the bountiful harvest. The crops had not yet been garnered on the Lake Champlain, and on every part of the Hudson, New York became the battlefield for the life of the young republic, and all this extended Schuyler's prayers for reinforcements. The commander-in-chief, in the plan of the campaign, had assigned to the Northern Department more than its share of troops and of resources, and had added even a brigade with men beyond the agreement, and of which his blood in pressing need, for the force of Howe was 4-fold the numerous as that from the Hudson to Maryland required to be guarded. The entreaties from Schuyler, from Jay, and Governor Morris as deputies of that council all urged upon Washington. Allen wrote to Schuyler they were not all alike in rank, fortitude. He referred to the North Arnold, who was fearless, a Lincoln who was incorruptible and brave and capable of the greatest exertion, and, even though it weakened his own army, interference who could write, and did write directly to the brigadier generals of Massachusetts and Connecticut, urging them to march from the Susquehanna with 1/3 part of the militia under their care and command. At the same time, he bade Schuyler select approximately 10,000 men to hold in detachments. Might fall upon some one of these detachments might prove fatal to the whole expedition.
In a like spirit, he counseled to the Council of New York the most sensible pleasure at the exertions of the state, diligence at every circumstance and every disadvantage. The success of Burgoyne, he predicted, would be temporary. The southern states could be asked to check their force, since it was all needed to keep Howe at bay. The attachment of the eastern states to a cause meant security when invoked for the safety of a sister state, of themselves, of the whole continent. The worst effect of defeat, if there be such a deliverance, was the panic which it produced. Calmly considered, the expedition was not formidable. If ever there should be necessarily seconded by its eastern neighbors, Burgoyne would find it repelled back to advance or to maintain his ground. All this while Schuyler continued to despond. On the 13th of August, he could write from Stillwater, Washington, the superior force daily increasing in numbers, and which will be doubled if General Burgoyne arrives at Albany, and I apprehend Albany accepted applause for the wisdom of his safe retreat. His first serious blow was struck at the Beta by the inhabitants of Tryon County. Burgoyne, on his return to London in 1775, had censured Carleton to Germain for not having sent by Lake Ontario and Oneonta and Mohawk River on an auxiliary expedition, which had been easily executed, he thought, and would bring the details for the exception chiefly by savages. To Carleton, whom he blamed of avoiding Lindsay, he announced the king's resolution that every means should be employed that Providence had put in his power for hard and crushing the rebellion. This detachment, which was set apart for the Lakes under the command of Colonel Barry St. Leger, varying from the schedule of Germain in its constitution and parts more than in its numbers, exceeded 350 white men. The Six Nations inclined to the British cause for fear of being finally abandoned by the king, and their numbers swelled of Burgoyne's invasion. Many would leave their old hunting grounds. The Oneidas were friendly to the Americans, and enough feared had to be added to the number. Butler at Irondequoit assured them that there was no hindrance in taking of Albany to Schuyler.
The Six Nations were encouraged by this, and they accepted durance in the warpath, that they would have only to look on and see Fort Stanwix fall. And for 7 days he lavished largesses on the fighting men and women and children, swearing to them with all the oratory that he had 8,000 Indian warriors, certainly more than 800, joined the White Brigade of St. Leger. In addition to these, Hamilton, the lieutenant governor of Detroit, in obedience to orders from the Secretary of State, sent 15 several parties, consisting in the aggregate of 280 Indian braves with 30 white rangers, to cooperate on the frontiers of Pennsylvania and Virginia. Collecting his forces as he advanced from Montreal by way of Oswego, St. Leger on the 3rd of August came near the carrying place, where for untold ages the waters of the Mohawk had borne Indian canoes. The rapids were too strong of the St. Lawrence from those of the Hudson. Fort Stanwix wanted to be well constructed, well furnished against artillery, and garrisoned by 600 or 700 men under Lieutenant Colonel Gansevoort, a descendant of the 1st Patroon. There his sister brought word that General Nicholas Herkimer and the militia of Tryon County were marching to be relieved. A plan was made to lay for them an ambush of savages. During the evening the savage little band with yells. The next morning, having laid aside their blankets and robes of fur, they all stood out, naked or wearing only hunting shirts, painted for the battle with their ghastly devices. Presently Sir John Johnson and Royal Yorkers by Colonel Butler and Rangers, by Claus and Canadians, and by Lieutenant Byrd and Regulars. The freeholders of the Mohawk Valley, most of them with the sons of Germans from the Palatinate for officers, 700 or 800 in number, untrained and a strength of the besieging party, marched earnestly through the wood. About 4 hours before noon, when they were within 6 miles of the fort, a part of the Indians and Tories lay in wait, and surprised in front by Johnson and his Yorkers, while the Indians attacked their right rear and, with the aid of the Tories' muskets, rushed in with their tomahawks. The patriots fell back without confusion and took their ground, and remained against superior numbers.
There was no chance for tactics in the battles of the wilderness. Some few whites fought behind trees or fallen logs, or the white man, born on the banks of the Mohawk, wrestled single-handed with the Seneca warrior, like himself, the child of the soil. Herkimer was badly wounded above the knee, but he set himself against a tree on the ground, giving orders to the end. Thomas Spencer slid the death of a hero. The battle raged for at least an hour and a half, when about 160 killed, wounded, or taken of the men on eastern New York returned to the battle with wild valor. 30 and 30 or more, among them the chief warriors of the Seneca, lay dead on the field, and twice as many more were badly wounded. Of the Yorkers, 1 captain; of Johnson's, 2 were killed. What names there are of casualties not told. The British loss, including savages and white men, was probably about 100. 3 men having crossed the Moines into Fort Stanwix to announce the approach of Herkimer, Gansevoort ordered a sortie. 250 men, half of New York, half of Massachusetts, under Lieutenant Colonel Willett, made a successful attack upon Sir John Johnson's camp, which was in the quarters of the Yorkers, the Rangers, and the savages, driving before them whites and Indians, chiefly women and children, capturing Sir John Johnson's papers, 5 British flags, the haversack and new blankets and hatchet of the Indians, with 4 prisoners. Learning from them the check to Herkimer, the party of Willett returned quickly to Fort Stanwix, bearing their spoils on their shoulders. The 5 captured colors were displayed at the fort, and a flag. The Indians were frantic at their losses and warriors. They suffered in the cliff nights from the loss of their camp and tents, and not even the torturing and killing of their captives could quiet their rage. The Iroquois could prevent them beginning to return home.
Meantime, Willett, universally as he was in companion, both good woodsmen, made their way past the water guard, at the British parties, at the Indian camp, to the nearest American post, at the distance of 22 miles, and having written, in 8 hours they brought relief. Arrived at Schuyler, charged Arnold with an expedition to relieve the garrison. Long before its approach, an Indian ran into St. Leger's camp, reporting that 1,000 Americans were coming against them. Another followed, doubling the number. A third brought a rumor that 10,000 were coming, and, deaf to remonstrances and entreaties from their superiors and from St. Leger himself, the whole body plundered the boats and made off with the booty. St. Leger, in a panic, though Arnold was not within 40 miles, hurried after them before nightfall, leaving his tents, artillery, and stores. It was Herkimer who'd first reversed the gloomy scene of the memorable campaign. The unerring judgment of the Mohawk Valley served him of country, not for rewards. He died and won a continental command or money. Before he expired, the best surgeons in Congress had despaired of his life, and they decreed him a monument. Gansevoort held fort with a state of constant suddenness, Willett by public praise and an elegant sword. The employment of Indian allies was fatal, reported them, and the ministry, and in due time the British Parliament, were informed that there was great remembrance to the Indian savages upon their friends, that they could not be controlled, that they killed the supporters, and those returning were infinite difficulty to manage them, that they grew more and more unreasonable and impertinent till they became intolerable. When the Seneca warriors, returning to their lodges, told the story of the slaughter of their women, their villages rang with yells of rage and howls of mourners. Burgoyne, who on the 30th of July made his headquarters on the banks of the Hudson, had detachments from 17 scattered other nations. A British officer described them as tall, warlike, and enterprising, but fiendishly wicked. On the 3rd of August, they brought in 20 scalps and many captives, and Burgoyne approved their incessant activity. He called them together again, and summoning them, he gave in orders to each regiment that the savages were enjoined to scalp every person they could find. At the Ottawa, lunged on to the 5th of August, Burgoyne took from all his red warriors a pledge to stay through the campaign. On the 6th, he reported himself to General Howe as well forward, imagining to gain the mouth of the Mohawk, but not likely before the 22nd or the 23rd of the month. At St. Leger, he'd already withdrawn. Then Burgoyne, on the 8th, sent all his best with draught cattle, horses, and provisions from fabled magazines at Frontenac. Burgoyne was at the head of an expedition commanded by Baum, a Brunswick colonel of dragoons, and composed of not less than 400 Brunswickers. Baum had artillerists, 2 cannon, the light corps of British marksmen, a party of Tories, and a horde of about 150 Indians. Burgoyne's marched directly upon Bennington. After disposing of the stores at that place, he might proceed on to Manchester, descend the Connecticut River to Brattleboro, and enter Albany through St. Leger and the western exit. The 13th, Baum encamped about 4 miles from Bennington on a hill that rises from Walloomskoik within the state of New York. When, early on the morning of the 14th, a reconnaissance party next morning met, he wrote in high spirits for more troops and continued among infantrymen. Burgoyne sent him the Brunswick lieutenant colonel with 2 Brunswick battalions and 2 companies, marched in a scant iron, though thick woods, in support. Don't forget to like this video and subscribe to the channel for more incredible untold stories from American history that will blow your mind.